and welcome to our first virtual authors event. North Harrow Community Library will be talking to a whole bunch of amazing authors and uploading those interviews right here to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to us so that you never have to miss one of our videos. Today we're so very pleased to be talking to the wonderful Leigh Russell. Leigh Russell has sold over 1 million crime fiction novels and is published in English and in translation throughout Europe and China. Her Geraldine Steel and Ian Peterson titles have appeared on many bestseller lists and reached #1 on Kindle. Leigh's work has been nominated for several major awards, including the CWA New Blood Dagger and the CWA Dagger in the Library. She also chairs the CWA Debut Dagger Award and is a Royal Literary Fellow. Leigh, it's so lovely to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come along and chat with you.
I think congratulations are in order because you published not just one book this year, but 2. And your latest book, I believe, came out just in July, Deadly Revenge. Are you excited to have it out?
Yes, it came out July the 23rd, so it's fairly recent. I am quite excited. It's the 14th book in this series. I think it's my 22nd published book, but the excitement never really goes away. I'm particularly pleased that so far, reviews on Amazon and the response from reviewers have been really positive, and I feel quite pleased with myself for that, really, because I think getting still seem to be, going down quite well. It's quite gratifying, because with every book in a series, and a long-running series, there's that kind of little nagging fear that is this going to be the book where people start saying, we've had enough of this series, it's gone off the boil, it's not fresh anymore. And so far so good, we still seem to be keeping up the interest, and readers still seem to be enjoying the books. So yes, I'm quietly rather pleased about that, rather than being wildly excited as I was when my first book came out. It's kind of reaction, but yeah, very happy about that.
I'm so glad. Could you tell us a little bit about your new book?
The new book, as I said, it's the 14th in my Geraldine Steel series. Geraldine Steel is my detective. Although I'm very conscious when I'm writing that there are a lot of people now who are following the series and following Geraldine Steel's progression, following her career, there are also a lot of people who don't know my series who might pick up this book without knowing anything about my detective. And so when I'm writing, I'm very conscious that I'm writing really for 2 readers. I'm writing for fans of the series who want to follow what's going on, what's happening. I'm also writing for readers who just happen to pick up the book, don't know anything about the backstory of my detective, and they want to enjoy the book and get as much out of it, same as people who are fans of the series. So it works as a standalone, as all the books in the series do, but it is a book in the series. And the book begins, as all my books do, with a murder, and then the whole thrust of the narrative is all the ins and outs and red herrings and so on, until we finally get to the end. And well, I won't tell you what happens in the end, because that's a bit of a spoiler, but you can probably guess. I look at social issues in my books. I think that's one thing that makes crime fiction particularly interesting, that it does look, it sort of holds up a lens through which we can look at society. So while I'm examining individual behaviour and how an individual might behave or react in a certain situation, I'm also interested in how we react and behave as a society. And the issue that comes up in my latest book, Deadly Revenge, which has come up in other books, but we focus on it particularly in this book, is the issue of domestic abuse. And I've written about this before. I've had, very often it will be a woman who is being abused, violently abused by her husband or by a man. Although I have also written about a man who was violently abused by a woman. I try to be even-handed. And I think the abuse of men is also an issue. And domestic abuse is a very hidden issue, isn't it? Because it goes on behind closed doors. And so that's an issue that I'm looking at in this book, alongside the murder investigation, which is the main thrust of the narrative. So that's a little bit about what the book's about.
I think perhaps we should whet the appetites of your readers with maybe a little extract from your latest book, if you're up for reading it.
Okay, this is a relatively long extract. It's just under 4 minutes. It's not the whole chapter. I'm reading from chapter 2. She recoiled, shocked into silence. Well, he demanded, taking a step towards her, his fists clenched but not yet raised. Well? On his lips, the innocuous word sounded charged with malevolent power, forcing her to edge away until she felt the wall pressing against her back. Well? Have you lost your tongue, you stupid bitch? I'm sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean... You didn't mean, he sneered. His fists rose and she winced, waiting for him to hit her. Instead, he spat in her face with such violence that she felt the impact of the saliva as it struck her cheek, warm for an instant, then cooling as it dribbled down her face towards her jawbone. She didn't dare move. Well, he repeated, how long are you going to stand there staring at me like an idiot? She shook her head. Her tears mingled with his saliva as her trembling fingers reached up to wipe her cheek. I won't do it again, I promise. I didn't think it would matter. I thought you wouldn't mind. I should have asked you. I'm sorry. Once she began, she couldn't stop babbling. I won't see her again without asking you first. I promise. It won't happen again. I should have asked you first. They both knew that she would never have capitulated so readily if he hadn't threatened her with his fists. He glared at her, and she lowered her eyes, terrified of infuriating him even more while he was in such a temper. He must have moved silently, because a moment later she heard the door close, and looking up, saw that she was alone in the room. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she slumped to the floor, sobbing quietly. Jason made it quite clear what he would do to her if she tried to leave him. On the few occasions she attempted to remonstrate with him, he lost his temper, although he never once hit her while she was pregnant with Daisy. In a way that made her feel worse than before, knowing that he could control his violent outbursts when he chose. In any case, it made no difference by then, because physical violence was only one of the methods he used to intimidate and control her. He had subtle ways to break her will, and she had learnt to become complicit in tolerating his abuse. What made the situation more difficult was that she had to conceal her injuries. In one of his fits of rage, he had clouted her so hard on the side of her head that the hearing in one of her ears was impaired. She dared not go to the doctor about it, for fear they would discover the cause of her partial deafness. Of course, she could have claimed that she had fallen over, but somehow lying like that seemed complicated. And whatever happened, she couldn't risk Jason finding out she had spoken about her injuries to a third party. If you tell anyone, he had whispered in her undamaged ear, I'll make sure you never see Daisy again. With every small concession to his will, she surrendered a little more of her freedom and lost another shred of her self-respect until she no longer had the power to resist his bullying. Looking back, she could hardly believe how readily she had come to tolerate his domination. Yet the truth was, it had all come about so slowly, she had scarcely noticed it happening. And now it was too late to leave him and start again. Life, with all its potential and its opportunities, had slipped from her grasp while she had been looking elsewhere. And still she could not leave him. Where would she go? Brought up by an overbearing father, she'd never learnt to fend for herself. The last thing she wanted to do was go crawling back to her parents. They had warned her that her marriage wouldn't end well. There'll be tears before bedtime, you mark my words, her father had told her. Jessica rarely went out, existing in a state of exhaustion in a strange, silent world, punctuated only by the baby's cries and brief exchanges with the cashier when she went to the supermarket.
Wow, that's powerful stuff, really amazing. Thank you so much for that. So just a couple of questions now, just to kind of get a feel for your writing and get a feel for how you write as well, I guess. So you have multiple series out. You've got the Geraldine Steel series, the D.I. Peterson series, and the Lucy Hall mystery series. Could you tell us a little bit about the premise for each series? I think you've said already that new readers don't have to kind of start from the beginning, that they can dip in and out. But what is each series based upon, would you say?
Well, Geraldine Steel series arose really by chance. So I was in my mid-50s and I'd stepped down from running a busy department at the school where I was working. And at the same time, my own children had grown up and left home. And so I really had some space in my head for kind of problem solving and thinking, I guess. I was still teaching, but I wasn't running the department. So I was under a bit less pressure there. And then one day I was walking through Pinner Memorial Park. I don't know, do you know it? In the park in Pinner, there's a bend in the path by the children's playground. And to one side of the path, there's a tangled copse of trees and shrubs just by the bend in the path. And so I was teaching, and I was visiting a student on work experience, and I took a shortcut through the park one day. And it was the summer term, but it was raining, so the park was deserted. And as I approached the tangled copse of trees and shrubs by the side of the path, a man came towards me, kind of scurrying, and there was something about him that looked a little bit dodgy somehow. He avoided meeting my eye and kind of hurried past. I walked on, and I glanced down, and sticking out from the ground cover underneath the trees and shrubs, through all the leaves, I saw a human hand. Now, there is a point at which that little narrative deviates off into fiction. I was in the park. I did walk past a stranger man and feel a little bit uneasy, I think because the park was empty and it was just me and him. And but there was nobody in the bushes. Several men have come forward since then and claimed to be that man who gave me my first inspiration, but I haven't recognized him since. Anyway, so I had this idea, what would I do if I was walking in the park and I stumbled on a body and I'd seen somebody in the park at that time? I would be able to go to the police and describe him. I would be able to pick him out in a lineup. And so this idea just somehow stayed with me. And when I got home, I started to write the story of the killer in the park. And I just became obsessed with this story and wrote compulsively. And so I wrote and I wrote and I wrote until after a couple of months, I thought, oh, I've written a book. And so I sent it out without really expecting anybody would be at all interested in it or read it. And a couple of weeks later, I had a telephone call from a publisher to say they were interested. And so they then offered me a 3-book deal based on that. And I've made it all sound very, very easy. In fact, once the book went to the editor, I had to do quite a lot of work because I had become obsessed with this character of this killer. What was he doing? What was going on there? And what's going on in his head? And my editor and my publisher both said quite rightly, they said, you have to make the character of your detective more engaging, because I'd really kind of brought her in initially just as a function of sorting out the plot. And they said, you know, no spoilers here, but the detective is the character who is going to continue on through the series. So she has to be more interesting even than the killer. So I worked on her, and so that was then published as cut short. And in the meantime, I had the 3-book deal, so I wrote the next 2 books. They seemed to do rather well. My publisher was very pleased, so he offered me another 3-book deal, and so on. And so now, book 14 has just been published. I have book 15 has been edited. That's out early next year, and I've delivered the manuscript for book 16. And my publisher has just offered me a contract for another 4 books, which will take us up to book 20. So the series is continuing. It just arose out of that one idea that I had one day. Where the Ian Peterson series comes from also arose from there, because in the first 3 books, Geraldine Steel is working in Kent, and she has a rather nice young sergeant, Ian Peterson, working with her. And in book 4 in the series, Geraldine moves to London as a kind of career move for a young, competent young police officer. And so she leaves her sergeant behind, but they kind of keep in touch, and he still meets up with her occasionally. A number of readers were a little bit miffed that Ian Peterson was no longer a major character in Geraldine's books. And so there was some demand for Ian Peterson to come back. So I wrote a trilogy for Ian Peterson. He starts in Kent, where he was working with Geraldine. He moves to York because he wants to move away from his in-laws. And so I then had a trilogy for Ian Peterson going concurrently with Geraldine Steele's series. So that got a little bit confusing because confusing for me because they met up with each other in each other's books. So I had to keep things going concurrently. By the end of book 6 for Geraldine Steel, something happened in her life, in her career, which I won't go into, a bit of a spoiler otherwise, but she had to leave London. She was demoted. And so I thought, well, where am I going to move her to? And York seemed to be the obvious answer. So she moves up to York and she's working with Ian Peterson again. So now the two of them are working together again in York. So that's where the Ian Peterson series came from. The Lucy Hall trilogy is something totally different. And the Lucy Hall trilogy came about because my husband had worked in Seychelles a long time ago when there was a political coup. And he told me lots of stories about what happened. And I thought, wow, this is just amazing. I have a first-hand account of what it was like being an expat living on a tropical island when there's a political coup. And so another publisher took that up and also wanted 3 books. So that became a trilogy for Lucy Hall, who's a young woman who becomes an investigative reporter. And they were quite fun. We had to go to Seychelles to do some research. Her next book is set in Paris and then she's in Rome. So we did a fair bit of traveling around. And then I've also written a couple of standalones, really just to see if I could. And they were published and did quite well. They're very different again. They're psychological thrillers. They're written in first person, which has different challenges to writing a book which is written from multiple viewpoints, because Geraldine Steel is written mainly from the point of view of the detective, but you do also see point of view of the victims, point of view of the killers, and then the whole thing kind of melds together. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, it didn't.
I never even intended to become a writer. I just had an idea one day, started writing, and here I am, 22 books on.
No, that completely answered my question. And I guess a question kind of leading off from that, writing for different series, is it fun to take a break from sort of one set of characters to engage in another world, or is it quite difficult to kind of extricate yourself from one world and then plop yourself down somewhere else? Is it a challenge or is it fun?
No, sometimes I need to have a break. Writing the murder stories, it's fairly intense. I mean, I think perhaps you could tell from the extract that I read, it can be quite intense kind of writing. And also I have to really keep my wits about me with the plot and remember who's where and what's happening here and why does this happen. So sometimes I just need to have a break and do something totally different. I can't stop writing somehow, so I'll just write something else. I do have a few other things. I've written a historical novel, and I've written a humorous novel, which I think is hilarious, but maybe other people won't. And also a dystopian novel, just when I was feeling a bit dark. They're with my agent at the moment. I don't know if they will ever be picked up. If there's any publishers out there looking for dystopian or historical or humorous writing, please do contact my agent. It's fun trying different things. Yeah. And writing in first person, as I say, is very different to writing in the third person. And writing a historical novel was, again, very different, trying to get into the mindset of somebody who lived 500 years ago. How did they feel about things? What did they think about things? Very different to how we think nowadays. And yet it has to be accessible to a contemporary reader.
I mean, you've said that it never crossed your mind to try and write a novel, that you never went out into the world thinking that you were going to be this best-selling author. And now you can't stop writing. What do you think your experience was like writing that very first book compared to writing now that you've got lots of nominated books under your belt, compared to when you were a relatively new writer?
It was quite extraordinary writing the first book, because I just got completely captivated by the writing, and I wrote something. It was like turning on a tap. I'd always read a great deal. I spent about 40 years just reading avidly, and then one day I started writing, and I just started writing compulsively, and it just kind of took over my life, really, writing. Starting a book now, there's slightly different pressures. I've done it before, so I kind of know I can do it. But at the same time, I know now that there are readers out there who are waiting for this book and are going to read the book. And when I wrote the first book, I didn't think anybody else would ever read it, let alone publish it. So in a way, it was kind of more fun because I could just do it for myself and be completely ridiculous with it if I wanted to be. Whereas now I have to think more carefully about my readers. And I did have to do a lot of work once my first book went to the editor to make it actually readable. Whereas now the editing process is fairly light because I've been edited so many times. As I'm writing, when I'm rereading something, I can sort of see what my editor is going to say and change it myself. So it's a different experience, but it's still just as much fun. I just love writing. And I think for me, there are two kind of aspects to writing. There's the outpouring of the story, and then there's the craft of knocking it into shape so that the reader will actually be able to follow it and understand it and enjoy it. And I think when I first started writing, it was just a whole outpouring and I became, as I said, I became obsessed with the killer, and I wrote pages and pages and pages about every little thing that he did. And I think to a reader, it probably would have got a bit tedious, but to me, I was just so engrossed in it, I couldn't see the wood for the trees. But now I'm much, much more conscious of my readers, and I'm writing for readers now rather than just for myself.
You've said that you've touched upon historical fiction and you've touched upon kind of humorous writing, but you came first of all to kind of crime, mystery, thriller, those kinds of genres. What do you think attracted you to that kind of genre? Had you read a lot of that genre? What was it that made you feel like this is what you were going to write 14, 15, 16 books in?
Well, I mean, it was no plan. I just had a story and wrote it. And I do think that to some extent, we don't find our stories, they find us. An idea pops into your head and suddenly it can spin out in all sorts of directions. But I think the crime genre, I mean, I think crime is basically conflict between people. And I think most literature includes crime. I mean, to me, the greatest crime writer of all time, I think, was Shakespeare. Think of his great plays. They're all crimes, aren't they? They're murders, they're matricides, they're all to do with people killing each other and vengeance. And I think most literature is based around some sort of conflict, some sort of crime, because that is what gives the story its drive and its excitement. And if you think about, say, the story of Romeo and Juliet, the character of Tybalt has a very, very small part, and he's killed off fairly early on, but he is the character that drives the narrative. If you take Tybalt out of the play, there would be no problem. He creates the conflict, really, and that pushes the narrative on and creates the tragedy. But I think there are very few books, think of any book almost. I mean, apart from maybe Jane Austen and light, humorous books, most books include a crime, don't they? Include a murder or a theft or something. So I think yes, police procedurals is a specific kind of crime book, isn't it? But I think the crime genre, it appeals because that's what appeals to us. That's what makes a good story. It's goodies and baddies, isn't it? I mean, I said earlier on, my books, they start with a murder. And there we are. That's your story. That's the beginnings of a story, isn't it? Because you want to know. A book will start with a question that makes readers carry on reading. So in a romance, it might be, are they actually going to get together? In a crime novel, it will be, is the criminal going to get caught? But you start with that question, and that's what keeps readers reading through the book. And crime, particularly murder, is a great question, isn't it? And somebody asked me once, they said, do you always have murders in your books? Do you ever have a book about burglary? Well, burglary is a horrendous crime. And if your house is broken into and your things are taken, it's a horrific intrusion into your life. So I wouldn't downplay the effects of that at all. It can really, really seriously affect people psychologically. But if you're writing a book and people are thinking, who is the next person who's going to get burgled? It's not quite as dramatic, is it, as who's the next person who's going to get murdered. So I think it's once you introduce a killer, you have that tension, don't you? When is it going to happen again? And you can't get much more suspense and tension than life and death, really. So I think crime fiction is exciting, it's good and bad is. I also think crime fiction appeals to us because it does give us a kind of moral compass. And I think the world these days seems to be so chaotic and meaningless and random. And in a crime novel, however awful the events in the novel are, and they are awful because somebody will lose their life, and the people who love them and the people around them, their lives will never be the same again, and I wouldn't gloss over that in my writing at all. But the detective is on the side of justice, and by the end of the novel, you know that some sort of moral order is restored. And I think that's one of the reasons that fiction appeals, because in life we don't always have that feeling that things will work out. Was it Oscar Wilde who said that the good are, I'll paraphrase, I can't remember the exact quotation, the bad are punished and the good are rewarded. That is the meaning of fiction. And I think we do have a really deep need and desire for justice, don't we? And in fact, Geraldine Steel, she says she's driven by a passion she seeks justice for the voiceless dead, people who have been killed. They can't seek the justice for themselves, and there's some sort of closure at the end of the book. I think a crime novel where the killer is not caught would feel a little bit unsatisfactory, perhaps, for the readers.
Right, so you talked about how you were quite an avid reader. What kind of books did you grow up reading? What kind of books do you enjoy reading now? And what are the types of books that you would recommend to everyone and anyone?
Oh, I'd recommend reading my books, of course. I used to anything and everything. I was one of these kids who always had their nose stuck in a book. I was a bit shy, and it was partly a kind of shield from the world, and partly also just because I was captivated by fiction. I think we need stories. So whether it was going down the rabbit hole with Alice or through the back of the wardrobe into Narnia, I think stories take us out of our own lives, don't they? They give us a break. It's like a holiday from reality. And I think we need that. We need that break from our lives, from the stresses and the strains and the challenges and sometimes just the tedium of everyday life. I think fiction gives us that escape from it. So I would recommend that people read anything that appeals to them. Once libraries are open again, soon please, I would suggest go to your local library and just browse around and pick up anything and try it. If you're not enjoying something, put it down, find something else. And there are just so many amazing writers out there. And I think a lot of the classics, they are classics because they have lasted for a reason. But there are also a lot of exciting new writers coming up. And it's very difficult to recommend one particular type of book or one particular author, because we're all different, which is what makes the human race so wonderful, that we are all completely different and we all like different things. So I think it's a good idea, a great idea, to belong to a book group where a group of people recommend books to each other, because you discover things that you might not otherwise have read. And I think it's good to be open to everything and try all sorts of things, because how do you know you're not going to enjoy something if you don't try it? But when I was growing up, yes, I loved the Narnia books. I read all the kind of children's classics that were around at the time: Treasure Island, The Coral Island, Little Women. And actually, the sort of books that I read when I was a child are quite sophisticated language, some of them. Authors then, Swallows and Amazons, they didn't seem to write down to children at all. And I think it's a careful juggling act, isn't it, between making literature accessible to children and actually stretching them. Because if you come across a word you don't know in a book, then you kind of have a vague supposition what it might mean. You come across it again in another context, and after you've come across it, say 3 times, you know what that word means. Well, you think of a child reading lots and lots and lots of books and coming across all sorts of words, being exposed to all sorts of language. That's how we learn. So I think reading is entertaining. It also it makes you think, doesn't it? You look at the world through different characters' eyes, you see different points of view, and you read what other authors, perhaps living at different times, have thought and felt about things that are important to them, enough for them to want to write them down. And there's just a wealth of experience there that people who don't read maybe are missing out on, although not everybody reads, and that's fine too. We're all different. I am not at all judgmental in any way about this, but I think reading is just a treasure for us all if we want to delve into it.
Do you think you'd ever write a children's novel, a children's book?
I don't know. I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, will you ever write a crime novel? I would admit, me, write a book? No. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, would you ever write a historical novel? Well, no, because I don't know any history. If you'd asked me, would I ever write a humorous novel? I'd be, well, no, because I'm just not a funny person. I'm kind of serious and earnest about things. So I don't know. I mean, I have no plans to write a children's book. I don't think I would be able to do that. But maybe I'll wake up tomorrow morning with a brilliant idea for a children's book and write it. Who knows? And that's part of the fun of writing, in a way that it's unpredictable. You just don't know what's going to come up. I think writing children's books is a very skillful task, because you have to gear it for a particular age. So in terms of content, in terms of language, in terms of chapter lengths, sentence lengths, this will be different, I'm guessing, for different age groups. And although I did teach secondary school for many years, I'm not really skilled at writing for children, but maybe I would try it. I don't know, is the answer.
What do you personally think makes a good crime or mystery novel?
Well, there are so many elements on there. There's the, I think the quality of the writing, for me, is important. I think very poor writing can get in the way, and that's often down to poor editing. I think a good crime or mystery novel, well, it needs to have a bit of mystery, doesn't it? You need to be trying to wonder who the killer was. Although, that said, in some of my books, they're more of a why done it than a who done it. And my first book, Cut Short, the reader encounters the killer fairly early on, and the reader knows who the killer is, but the detectives don't. And so it's a question of how many more people is he going to kill before the detectives catch up with him. That's kind of fun. You can use what I call the Jaws technique, you know, the film Jaws. And once the director has killed that woman in the sea, all he has to do, and of course the music helps as well, all he has to do is put a woman in the water by herself, put a child in the water by themselves, and the audience is on the edge of their seat. Is this going to be the next shark victim, next victim of a shark attack? And writing about a serial killer, one can play around with that trope. You establish your serial killer, and then you can raise the expectation that someone is going to be the next victim, and then you can fulfill the expectation or confound it. You know, somebody, in one scene in my first book, I have a young girl walking along the street, and she hears footsteps behind her. And the reader knows by now that there's a killer prowling the streets looking for young girls. So you're kind of on the edge of your seat. Is she going to be the next victim? And maybe she is, maybe she isn't. Maybe she gets away, but her friend who'd gone out to find her becomes the next victim. So there are these tropes and expectations that readers have that you can play around with. The thing I find most difficult, and this is something that, coming back to your question, making a good mystery, the thing I find the most difficult about writing a crime novel is staying one step ahead of my readers. Most of my readers, and most readers of crime fiction, most readers in fact, are sophisticated readers. They've read a lot. How can I misdirect them? I'll do something which I think is going to be a clever red herring, and the reader will think, oh, okay, yeah, that's obviously a red herring. I'll try and correct them. Oh yeah, there's a misdirection. So I find it very difficult to stay one step ahead. In some of my books, I think I've done it really well, and everyone said, wow, didn't see that ending coming. I don't manage that in all of my books. But in the first book, as I say, the reader is introduced to the killer. And in some of my books, the reader kind of has a pretty good idea who the killer is, knows more than the detectives do. So it's kind of dramatic irony, because you see the detectives going off on their investigation and questioning people and looking here and there, and they're looking in the wrong place. And the reader knows that, but there's nothing you can do about it. So there's the quality of the writing, there's the mystery. character, I think, is always important. If readers don't care about characters, then they're not going to care as much what happens to them. So as well as having the sort of clever plot twists, readers need to be rooting for a particular character. They need to be engaged by the characters and care about them. So there has to be some emotional interaction from the read. And just the suspense and the drama of it, I think, the page turning of it. And I'm very aware of that when I'm writing my books. The structure of the book is very important. So I try not to have too many chapters where it's just boring police procedure to make the book seem authentic and realistic without anything dramatic happening. But on the other hand, I don't want too many dramatic things happening all at once and then having a lull. So things have to be paced out, and that's where the craft of the comes in, really. So I think there's quite a lot that goes into making a good drama out of a mystery. And it's not just about the ending, the whodunit. I mean, if you take Frederick Forsyth, The Day of the Jackal, we'll know that, I can't remember what his name is, but it's about the guy who tried to assassinate de Gaulle. And we all know that he didn't succeed, but it's so exciting. Or Romeo and Juliet. I mean, we know what the ending is, don't we? We know that they both die in the end. But a good production can still be really moving. So it's what happens, but it's also how it's put across, I think. And sometimes it's impossible to say what makes something into a good book, really. I think for me, a good book is something that maybe gives you a little bit of an insight, makes you think a little bit, opens your eyes to something. But there's all sorts of elements go into a good book, and I don't think there's a one size fits all, really. Doesn't really answer your question. I can't answer.
It does. I mean, you've already given us lots of tips about what perhaps makes a good book, but also this idea that it really depends on who you're writing for and how you choose to write as well. Do you have any kind of overall tips for new, unpublished writers who are just getting into it? What would you say is perhaps a big tip that you wish you had known earlier on in your career, maybe?
Well, I do think that the best advice I've ever seen that was given to aspiring writers was by, I'm pretty sure it was William Faulkner, and he said, read everything. And then I'm then going to paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quotation after that. But he said, by reading, you'll get to know what works and what doesn't work. You're kind of honing your critical faculties. And then when you start to write, you will sort of know if your writing is working or not. And I think inadvertently, I trained myself to write by reading every day for 40 years. And then when I started writing, I sort of had an instinct for how stories work. So that's very important advice, I think. I think it's incredibly difficult now. I mean, I was very fortunate that I got in just before the ebook revolution, really. Ebooks were around when I was first published, but a fellow author said to me when my first book came out, he said, you should get your publisher to bring it out as an ebook. And I'd heard of ebooks, but I wasn't actually quite sure what they were. And 6 months after the print copy came out, my publisher brought out an ebook. Well, now the ebook and the print book come out simultaneously. Sometimes the ebook even comes out first. So I think the publishing landscape has changed almost beyond recognition, and there are so many books being published now. The buzzword now in publishing is discoverability, because you can write a brilliant book, but how is anybody going to find it among the absolute multitude of books? I can't remember the figure, but thousands of books being published every hour in the UK alone. And that's, with self-published books, it's just completely mushroomed, which is a wonderful thing because it's really democratizing. Anybody now can write a book and put it out there. But it also means that the competition for each individual author is fierce, is very fierce. So my advice is, I think I would still say, try to find a literary agent and a publisher if you possibly can, because you then have a team around you and behind you to advise you and help you. And I've found that enormously helpful. I mean, I wouldn't have known where to find an editor for my books. Where do I find a good editor? my publisher obviously knew the editor who would write for my books, and they have a proofreading team and all the rest of it. So I would say read as much as you can. I would say rewrite endlessly. Well, again, there are no rules really. I don't know if you know William McIlvanney. He sadly died not that long ago. He's known as the father of tartan crime. He was a wonderful Scottish crime writer. And he said when he was teaching creative writing, he used to say to his students that one of the most useful things he could tell them was not to listen to him, because nobody can tell you what to do and how to write. I think the only golden rule for me is to make it work. So if you wanted to write a book where it started in first person, was then in second person, then moved to third person, then back to second person, then first person, it sounds absolutely ridiculous. And on the face of it, I think it, just wouldn't work at all. But if you can make it work, then it works. I think as a writer, you have to trust yourself. Other people will give you all sorts of opinions and all sorts of views. If you don't have that inner strength as a writer, that inner confidence, that trust in yourself, then you don't have your own writing voice to kind of peep to, and then it can just become diffused with all different opinions. Because if you ask 10 people for an opinion, you're going to get 10 different opinions, and you will find there are people who think they could write it better, there are people who don't like something about your writing. So again, having a team around me, I have an editor who I trust absolutely, and having a good editor is really important. I think you have to work hard, really. Being a writer is hard work. Although it's such fun, it doesn't seem like work. And I think you have to be brave, because once you put your book out there, while you're writing it, it is your book. And believe me, every book that I write in my head is the best thing I've ever written. Once it's published and people start commenting on it, it belongs to everybody else, and they can say what they like about it. And some people will try and shoot you down. So you have to be a little bit thick-skinned. I think my favorite review that I had on Amazon, this was when I first got to #1 on Kindle, and then suddenly there was a little spate of 1-star reviews, and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. And the best one was somebody just put, I've heard better stories from my cat. Great, and gave it 1 star. But that was a book that was in the Times top 10 crime novels, so I mean, I wasn't too bothered by that 1-star review. But you do get a lot of reviews. You have to be a bit thick-skinned and just keep going. So I think, just to boil it down, the advice would be to read, to work at your writing, keep rewriting, be critical of yourself. Write what you enjoy writing, because you're going to spend a lot of time doing it. Be thick-skinned and just carry on, really. I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, I have taught creative writing classes, and I've done master classes in colleges. I've taught courses on a Greek island for Skiros writing lab, and so I've done a 2-week writing course. There was just so much to say, so I've tried to whittle it down a bit, really.
No, that's perfect. So yeah, lastly, a very important question from our standpoint: why do you think libraries are important?
Oh dear me, what an important question that is. I can still remember the first time I went into a library, and that visceral sense of excitement, looking around and seeing all these books that you could reach out and see and touch and open and look at. And I remember thinking, I want to read every book I can see in this library. And I think there are a lot of people who don't have many books in their home, children brought up in homes without books, people who can't afford to buy many books. And it gives everybody access to books, to literature. And I think for me, it is without doubt one of the key signs of a civilized society that we have libraries and books available for everybody. I think it's important for me in the same way that free healthcare, free at point of delivery, I should say, healthcare is important, because I think everybody, and particularly children perhaps, because nowadays adults do have access to books on the internet, which don't have to be expensive. But I think particularly for children, if you don't grow up in a home where there are books. If there are no libraries, there are no books. And I can't imagine what a world without fiction and stories and sort of information you can get from books would be like. So I think libraries are really important, and I'm absolutely horrified by what is happening in our library services in this country. I know that things have to be prioritised, and I know that funding is not unlimited, but why build a new road that nobody particularly wants when you could put all that money into shoring up libraries? I mean, there's just so many ways in which I think money is being spent that would be better spent on libraries. I'm a passionate advocate of libraries, as you can tell.
Leigh, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. You can get Leigh Russell's latest book, Deadly Revenge, now wherever books are sold. Thanks so much, Leigh, and I hope you have a really great rest of the day. It's a lovely day out there, so
yeah, we're going to get even hotter apparently. Nice day to just sort of sit in the shade and read.
Thank you so much for watching this video. You can find all the details about the author and their work down in the description box below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe. We're a small independent community library, and so we need your help to keep us going. If you'd like to support us, we have a PayPal link in the box below. We also have lots more videos available on our channel for children and adults alike, so please do check those out. North Harrow Community Library wouldn't be able to survive without your generous support, so thank you. If you'd like to find out more about our library, please use the links in the box below. See you soon.